In this video, we're going to learn about command line. I'm going to show you some basics and talk about why it's important that as a web developer, you understand how to work in the command line. To begin with, what is the command line? Well, it's just a means of interacting with a computer system via commands. As an example, I have a command line program open right now on my Mac operating system. And the first thing to understand about when you're working in command line is that everything you're going to be doing is relative to the current directory that you're in. In this example, you could see that the current directory I'm in is the desktop folder on my computer. So to kick things off with a really simple command, I could run a command called ls or list. And what this will do is it'll show me the contents of my desktop. Then from there, I could move into other directories. So for example, if I wanted to move into this directory called example, I would say cd or change directory, and then the name of the directory I want to move in. And you can see now my prompt is updated, reflecting that I am now in this example directory. If I run list again, I can now see the contents of this directory, and I see it's just got a simple text file. And I could run a command called cat, which is short for concatenate. What this will do is if you give it a path to a text-based file, it'll show you the contents of that file. So if we say cat hello.txt, we can see what's in that file. Now, obviously, everything I've just shown here is not very impressive because as average computer users, we would typically do things like this using the graphical interfaces that our operating systems provide. For example, in Mac, I would use things like the Finder program, and I can navigate to my desktop directory, and then I would see the contents, and then I could go one step further into that example directory where I see my hello.txt file. And if I double click this, it'll open it up in another program where we could see the contents. Now, seeing this example, you might question, well, why bother with the command line? If we have these nice graphical programs, why spend the time memorizing and dealing with these little tedious commands? And the answer to that question is that there are situations where command line is actually going to excel when it comes to getting certain jobs done versus how we would do them in a graphical program. And that's one of the things I want to highlight in this video. I want to highlight what I think to be the three most important reasons why, as a web developer, it's important to understand how to work in the command line. Reason number one has to do with tools. There are several tools that exist that help us with the web development process that are built for command line, and many of them don't have a graphical alternative. For example, things like dependency management programs. These are programs that can pull in outside software and dependencies that we might need to use in a project, and oftentimes they're run via command line. Another tooling example, if you are a front-end web developer and you're working with JavaScript files, CSS files, oftentimes there is processing that has to happen to these files. You might be combining them together. You might be compressing them or minimizing them so that they'll load faster. And all of these things can be done with several different kinds of command line tools, but one of the most popular ones is called Webpack. And once again, it's a command line based tool, so in order to work with it, you got to be comfortable with command line. So those are just a couple examples of popular tooling that you'll come across as a web developer that relies on command line. Now, related to that, reason number two why I think it's important to understand command line is that you can often do things in a more efficient or a simpler way via command line than you can via a graphical interface. For example, as web developers, we often like to automate processes. Let's say you're building a portfolio for a photographer and they have hundreds of images they want to feature. And for each of those images, they need a smaller thumbnail size image for it. If you're comfortable with command line, you could actually write a script that would go through and process those images for you. And then as needed in the future, you could rerun that script on new images. And that'll save you a lot of time versus having to manually open each file, resize it, save it, etc. Another common thing that web developers often like to automate is deployment processes. So when you get to the point where you have changes to a code base and you want to go live with them on, say, a production server, there's often a series of steps you have to go through to make that happen, including checking in your code with version control, running any sort of tests, and then finally pushing the code changes to your server. Now, of course, you could do all of those things manually, or you could write a command line based program that could automate those steps for you, making the deployment process much quicker. Now, speaking of servers, this actually brings me to my third and final point about why I think it's important for web developers to understand command line, and that has to do with interacting with servers. If you're just doing very simple website development, you might be using a shared server that provides you with graphical web-based interfaces for managing that server. But when you really get into things and you start building more advanced applications, typically what you'll do is you'll connect to your server using a tool called SSH. And once you're connected, you will interact with that server purely via commands. And the reason for that is because web servers are built to be as efficient as possible. So they don't have like heavy graphical based operating systems. They're much more bare bones and purely command line based. So now that we understand the importance of command line, let's talk about the practicalities of it. How do we actually work with it? If you're a Mac user, you can use a program that comes with your system by default called Terminal. The easiest way to find this is to click your spotlight icon and just search for it. Similarly, if you're on a Linux-based operating system, it also comes with a program called Terminal. You could find that within your applications. And then if you're on Windows, it gets a little bit more complex because by default, the command line programs that come with Windows don't operate the same as the command line programs that we find on Mac and Linux. So for Windows users, I recommend using a program called Git Bash, which is a command line emulator that's going to give you the same experience on Windows that you get on Mac and Linux-based operating systems. To get set up with Git Bash, go to gitforwindows.org and download the program it offers here. This actually includes a couple different programs related to Git, but the thing we're most interested in is going to be Git Bash, which will be included as part of the download. So you'll download it, you go through the installation procedures, and when you're done, you should have access to the Git Bash program, which looks like this. So now that we all are set up with our command line based program, let's go through some basic commands. And what we're going to do is just some basic file and directory work, things like moving into directories, creating files, editing files. This is one of the foundational things you use in command line. So it's just a good way to get familiar with the system. And to begin with, let's just observe that within our command line program, we're always working at this prompt. The prompt is basically where it's waiting for us to type in commands. And what you see at your prompt is going to vary. It's going to vary possibly based on what directory you're currently in. And it's also going to vary based on the configurations within your computer and your specific command line program. All this is to say, don't worry if the prompt you're currently seeing looks different than what I'm showing on my screen here. So to kick things off, at our prompt, we're going to write our first command. And what I want us to do is all move into a directory that I know should exist on all our computers, and that's our desktop directory. To do that, I'm going to use the change directory command, or CD. And then the desktop is going to be found within our computer's home directory. And a shortcut we can use for the home directory is this little tilde character. You'll find it above the tab key on the left side of your keyboard. And then we'll say /. That should get you to your home directory. And let's go ahead and move into there first. And in my case, I do have my command line program configured so that my prompt always shows the current directory I'm in, which right now it's saying user Susan, which is actually my home directory. Now, if you don't see this as part of your prompt, you can run a command called pwd, and that'll show you your present working directory. So in my case, it should reflect the same thing I'm seeing in my prompt, and you can see that that's the case. So now that we're in the home directory, let's run the list command, or ls for short, to show the contents of this directory. And within here, we should see our desktop directory. So let's run that cd command again, and now we're going to move into the desktop directory. So I'm going to say cd desktop. And now that we're here, let's go ahead and run the list command again, just to see what we currently have in our desktop. And of course, what you see on your computer is going to vary. But within here, what we want to do is create a directory where we can put some practice work. So the way we're going to create directories is using a command called mkdir, or mkdir. And then we will come up with a name for the directory, and I'm just going to call it practice. We can run the list command again just to confirm that that directory was created. You can see that was added. And then we can move into that directory using our change directory command again. And then within here, let's just run list again just to show that it's empty, which is to be expected. We just created it. So now that we're in this directory, let's create just a basic text file. A few different ways we could go about doing this, but I'm going to use a command called touch. What the touch command does is it'll actually update the timestamp of a given file. And if you give it a path to a file that doesn't exist, it will actually create that file for you. So here I'm going to say touch example.txt, and it should just generate a new empty text file. And after each of these steps, I'm just going to keep running that list command just to see the steps are actually doing what I'm expecting. And you could see it did create our example.txt file. Now let's talk about editing the contents of this file. Of course, I could bring up my favorite code editor and open this file and make changes there. But because we're focusing on the command line, I want to show you the command line way of doing that. And the way I'm going to show you to do that is using a command line based program called Nano. It's a very simple command line text editor. So we're just going to say Nano and then give it the path of the file we want to edit. In this case, that's just example.txt. And that's going to bring up this Nano interface. Now, I actually have a whole separate guide on Nano specifically, so I'm not going to go into the full details here. I'm just going to show you how to make some changes and save those changes. So starting with making the changes, let's just write some text in this file, and I'll just say hello world. And then to save those changes, we want to run this exit shortcut down here. And the way we're going to do that is by holding the Control key followed by the letter X. So it's going to be Control X. It's going to ask us if we want to save our changes. We're going to type the letter Y for yes, and then we'll hit enter. Now to confirm that those changes were saved, we can use another command called cat. This will show us the contents of a text file. So we'll say example.txt, and we should see that text that we just added via Nano. So far so good. We've created a directory. We created a file within that directory, and we were able to edit its contents. Let's talk about amending things, making edits. For example, let's say I wanted to rename this file to example1.txt. There's a couple different ways I could do this. One, I could use the copy command, or CP for short, and I could specify that I want to copy example.txt into a new file called example1.txt. And the end result of that, if I list my directory contents, is I should now have both of those files in existence. So if I just want to end up with just example1.txt, what I would want to do now is delete the original. And to do that, I can use the remove command, or rm for short, and specify the name of the first file. All right, so the end result is I end up with just example1.txt. Another way we could have done that is using the move command, or mv for short. And the move command is going to take two arguments. Argument number one is going to be the source file that we want to move. So in this case, let's take example1.txt, and I'm going to rename it to example2. So our source will be example1.txt, and then our destination, in this case, is just going to be our new file name. So I'm going to say example2.txt. And once again, if we list our directory contents, we should see that that file was renamed, or technically it was moved into this other file with a new name. Now, while we're talking about the move command, let's actually look at an example where we can move a file to a different location or a different directory from where we currently are. For example, let's say I want to take example2.txt and move it out of this practice directory into my desktop. I could do something like this. I could say move example2.txt, and then I want to specify the path of where I want to move this file to. And there's two different ways I could do this. One, I could give an absolute path. I can give it like the full location for this file. So that would be something like users Susan desktop example2.txt. Or alternatively, we did see that the shortcut for our home directory is just that tilde character. So we could also specify it like that, but that's the full path to it. The other thing we could do for our path is we could give a path that's relative to our current directory, right? So we're currently in practice, and what we want to do is move this file basically up one directory to our desktop. So the way we would indicate that is using a shortcut that looks like this. It would be period, period, /. Whenever you see period, period, / in command line, it's basically referencing one directory up. So in this case, it's out of the practice directory into the desktop. So let's run that. And now if we list the contents of our practice directory, it should be empty because we moved that file out of it. And to confirm that it showed up at our desktop, let's go back to our desktop, which several different ways we could go about this. We are going to use the change directory command. So we could say, okay, go to my home directory, then go to my desktop. Or based on what we just learned about this .. we could just say change directory and go back one out of practice. And that should also get us to our desktop. All right, so here we're on our desktop, and if we list the directory contents, we should see our example2.txt file there. And this is an important thing to understand about working in command line. When it comes to specifying paths, you can use an absolute path, which is like the full address to that directory, or you can use relative paths that are always going to be relative to the current directory you're in. And there are use cases for both. Sometimes absolute paths are more convenient. Sometimes relative paths are more convenient. It often just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So at this point, we've seen examples of creation. We've seen examples of modification. Let's look at the third piece of the puzzle when it comes to working with files and directories, and that's deletion. Let's start by deleting this example2.txt file. The way I'm going to do that is with the remove command. So I'm going to say rm and then just the name of the file. And then we could run our list command again just to make sure that that was actually deleted. Next, let's create or remove our practice directory. Now, if I just try to do the remove command on a directory, what we're going to see is an error. It's telling us that it can't remove it because practice is a directory. So to get a directory to go away, we have to modify our remove command and add what is called a flag. A flag is like additional configuration we give to our commands to tell them how to operate. And in this case, the flag we want to use is the recursive flag, or -r for short. What this will do, because we're working with directories that potentially have contents, it's saying that we want to remove not only this directory, but any of the contents within the directory. All right, so by adding that -r flag, we should be able to now delete the practice directory. All right, so we didn't get an error. And again, if we run our list command, we can confirm that we no longer see the practice directory there. So that's just one example of a flag. And an important thing to understand is most commands have many different flags that you can use. For example, this list command we've been using so frequently, a flag that I often like to use for that is the -l flag. This is short for long format. And this is going to give us a lot more detailed view of this directory. So we can see all of the files, when they were created. This is permission information about the files, just a lot more meta information that is often useful information that we need to see. Flags can also be stacked. So I could do something like ls-la. And the A here is going to modify our list command so that we will also see any hidden files in a directory. So you can see I got several more results there because I do have some hidden files on my desktop and I can see them once I added that A flag. Now, in terms of learning more about these commands we're using and understanding what flags are available and what they do, there's a few points of reference you can go to. If you're on a Mac or Linux, directly within command line, you can run the man command, short for manual, and then you could specify the name of the command you want to learn more about. So let's take a look at the manual for the list command. So here we can see general details about this command, what it does, a description of it, and then here are all the flags or options we can use when working with this command. Now, when you're in the manual, you're kind of like stuck in the manual mode. You can see we don't see our regular prompt here anymore. To get out of the manual, run the keyboard shortcut Control-Z, and that'll get you back to your prompt. Now, as I said, that will only work in Mac and Linux environments, won't work on Windows. So as an alternative, a site that I like to often use is called explainshell.com. And this is really neat. You can type in a full command here and it will break down each part of the command. For example, earlier we did something like move example1.txt to example2.txt. So we'll have it explain that command, and you can see it breaks down each specific part of the command, telling us what it does. And in the case of the actual commands itself, if we click on them, it'll take us to a documentation page for that command. So here we see a nice summary of all the different flags that are available for this command. Or if we go back to the original output, there's a link at the bottom that'll take you to the official manual page for this command. And that's where we could see the full details, just like we were seeing when we ran the man command directly in command line. So that's really useful. You could just, let's say you want to learn more about the list command, you could have it explain it, and then you could follow the links to go to more details. The other place that I really like this tool is oftentimes when you are trying to figure out how to do something in command line, you might be searching on Google and coming across different industry forums. And oftentimes people will provide solutions where they say, okay, run this command and that should fix your problem. Oftentimes you might not understand everything that's going on in the command that they're sharing, and that could be a little risky to just take some command that some user on the internet is giving you and saying, trust me, this will do what you want. If you're not sure what that command is doing, come over here and paste it in, and it'll actually break down each part of that command, giving you insight into what it's doing. Right. And there's several great examples here that they provide. So let's say, you land on Stack Overflow, somebody's saying, hey, run this command. You could see, okay, what is the individual pieces of this command? What is it actually doing? And resources like this, explain shell or the man command, that's actually where I'm going to leave you on this whole exercise. Because that's what you're going to do next on your journey to getting comfortable with command line is you're just going to spend time with it. You're going to look up commands as you come across them and just become more and more familiar with it the more you work with it. My intention with this video is not to be a comprehensive, here's everything you could do in command line, just because there's really too much to cover in one particular video. Instead, I just wanted to give a general introduction to kickstart your journey into learning how to work within the command line. Now, before we wrap things up, I am going to leave you with a couple quick tips. One tip is that whenever you're working in the command line, if you use the up arrow, you can cycle through previous commands that you've run. So that could be really useful. I find myself doing this if I write out a long command and let's say I had a typo in it and I run it and it doesn't work, I could just use that up arrow to get to that command again, make the edits I need and rerun it. Another tip is that as you're writing out paths to files or directories, you can use the tab key to auto-complete them. To show what I mean, I'm just going to go back to like the root directory on my computer. So I'm going to say cd /, and now I'm going to move back into that desktop directory going one directory at a time. So I'm going to start with users, then I'm going to go to Susan, then I'm going to go to desktop. So I'm going to say cd, and I'm just going to start typing users and just put in the first couple letters. And if I hit the tab key, it's going to complete it for me. Then I'll start typing in S for Susan. And again, I hit the tab key. Now in this case, I found two directories within users that start with S. So it's showing me the options. Here I want to go to Susan. So I'll just type in the next letter U, hit tab again, and then you can see it auto-completed it. And then finally, I want to go to the desktop. So I just type in D, hit the tab key. I've got several options for things that start with D. So I'm going to say E for desktop, tab again, and then there we go. I should be able to get into that desktop directory. So that's one of those tips that can save you some time as you're typing out your commands. And then my final tip, which isn't really a specific tip, more of a general strategy, is I recommend when you're learning about command line, just have like a notebook open next to your computer. And anytime you learn a new command, just jot it down with a brief summary of what that command does, just to offload it from your brain. Because when you first start working with command line, it can be overwhelming to try to memorize every single command that you're learning. So just being able to create a little cheat sheet for yourself can really make the process go smoother.